Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining tonight's information session to hear an update on the status of the Columbia River Treaty Modernization. My name is Brooke McMurchie with the Province of British Columbia, and I'm pleased to be your facilitator tonight. I'm joining you this evening from the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And I also acknowledge the territories of the Ktunaxa, the Secwépemc, and the Syilx Okanagan nations that extend across the Columbia River Basin. There are almost 500 of you listening in right now. It's great to see so many familiar names from both sides of the border. I see a lot of you who have participated in our sessions regularly over the years, and I see some new faces as well. So just welcome everybody. It's great to see you here, and thanks for taking the time tonight. This session is being recorded and will be available afterwards for you to rewatch or share. So before we get going, I'll briefly explain how this session will go. We'll begin with an update on the treaty modernization process, as you all know, from BC's Minister of Energy and Climate Solutions and Minister responsible for the Columbia River Treaty, the Honourable Adrian Dix. We'll also hear from regional MLAs in the Canadian Columbia Basin, Steve Morissette, MLA of Kootenay-Monashee, and Brittny Anderson, MLA of Kootenay Central. We'll then move into questions for the remainder of our time together before we adjourn in about an hour. So we received a good number of questions ahead of this meeting, and I want to thank everybody who took the time to send those in. We also expect to receive a lot of questions from you during this session. We have many people online and of course won't be able to answer every question, but we'll endeavor to respond to as many themes as we can tonight. We see every question that's being entered in, and while we might not read your question out loud, we will attempt to address the issue that you're raising. And what we're not able to address here tonight, we'll continue to address on our website and other communications afterwards. And any of the questions that have been emailed to us, we'll respond to you through email. So to ask a question here tonight, please type it into the Q&A box. It should be at the bottom of your screen, a little Q&A button. Please do not type questions in the chat. We're not monitoring the chat for questions, so they'll be missed. Please use the Q&A box. In the interest of time, please try and keep your questions direct and to the point. Please type full questions so we know what your topic is about. And out of respect, of course, for all those listening in and for the presenters, please be respectful in your tone and your use of the chat and the Q&A functions. Derogatory language or comments towards any individual will not be tolerated, and anyone using abusive language will be removed from the session. So with that, I think we're ready to get started, and I would like to now welcome Minister Adrian Dix.
It's great to be here tonight. I'm very glad to be with you this evening. I'm joining you from my constituency office in East Vancouver, from the territories of the Musqueam, of the Squamish, of the Tsleil-Waututh. I want to say how much I appreciate the participation tonight. We're getting on towards 600 people in the webinar, and that's, I think, a demonstration of the interest both in the region and beyond in issues around the Columbia River Treaty. I want to acknowledge tonight, in response to questions, we're going to have a great team of people who will be around to help us, including the BC and First Nations leads on the Canadian negotiating delegation, which include Les McLaren and Kathy Eichenberger for the province, Nathan Matthew, Troy Hunter, and Jay Johnson for the Secwépemc, the Ktunaxa, and the Syilx Okanagan Nation in particular will be here as well and available to assist me in answering your question. Of course, as all of you know, quite a bit has changed since the last time we got together in December to discuss these issues. There is a new U.S. administration, and the issues surrounding the new administration. And honestly, it's a tax on Canada, on our sovereignty, the first of their kind, certainly in my lifetime or in a couple of centuries, have made people think a lot about the Columbia River Treaty, about its implications for our relationships between British Columbia and our really loved neighbors to the south of us in Washington State and in the whole Pacific Northwest region. There's been talk about the administration, the Trump administration, wanting waters. There's been no shortage of attention on all sides. Some people have said we should cancel the Columbia River Treaty, or that the treaty is a card that can be played in dealing with these U.S. trade issues. I get asked that question from time to time in the local Save on Foods, for example, on the weekend again. So against this backdrop, I felt it was important for us to have a chance to speak to you directly, to tell you what the current situation is, and to answer some of your questions. The treaty, as all of you know, this treaty is a significant part of the modern history of British Columbia, the modern history of the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and of Canada. But in particular, for those of you joining us from the Columbia Basin, I know how much the treaty has impacted your lives and your families and the communities and the ecosystems you're connected to. My colleagues MLA Brittny Anderson and Steve Morissette will speak about the treaty modernization process, our engagement with Basin communities, and the agreement in principle reached last summer. But I first wanted to let you know where things are at now. As you know, as the world knows, the US administration changed in January. As a result, the discussions between Canada and the United States on amending the Columbia River Treaty are currently paused, while the new US administration conducts a broad review of their international engagement. That sounds like a strange euphemism for what's going on. But in general, and in normal circumstances, this is not unusual. When the Biden administration replaced the Trump administration, and it's important to remember that these discussions started under the first Trump administration and continued under the Biden administration and reached an agreement in principle in July of last year, it's regular practice for a new administration to review processes. The Biden administration restarted negotiations in the fall of 2021, having taken office in January of 2021. And that's been our experience in the past. But it's important to be clear that Mr. President Trump and his administration has not formally suspended treaty negotiations, but rather had paused to review all of their international files, including the Columbia River Treaty. So some of this is normal and what one might expect. But what is different, obviously, and we all know this, is the threats to Canadian sovereignty, the attacks in terms of threatened and implemented tariff measures against Canada, and the direct threats of the President of the United States with respect to British Columbia, Canada, and our water changes it. These really vicious anti-Canadian attacks made on us cause concern in the context that we are in with respect to the Columbia River Treaty. We are preparing for any action the American government might take and will continue to defend Canadian and British Columbian interests. There's been speculation about the treaty negotiations in the context of the tariffs and trade dispute. Some have suggested that the treaty is a bargaining chip or that Canada should terminate the treaty as a retaliatory move. It's important to understand that if Canada were to issue a notice to terminate the treaty, the existing treaty would remain in effect for 10 more years, unless both countries agreed to terminate the agreement within that time frame. The same would go for the termination of the treaty on the American side. In short, if we were to take action to terminate the treaty, that action would take effect after British Columbia elections, for example, in 2028 and in 2032, scheduled elections, American elections in 2028 and 2032, and the Canadian elections in 2025, 2029, and 2033. In short, Canadian action to terminate the treaty would have little effect on the current dispute and would obviously involve losses on all sides. But let's be clear, we're going to defend our interests, even if terminating the treaty as one of those tools is not effective in our current dispute with the United States. So what is our approach? We remain committed to working with the US when they are ready to re-engage, to reach agreement on a modernized treaty that reflects the agreement in principle. A modernized Columbia River Treaty would provide greater, more balanced benefits to both countries compared to the existing treaty. British Columbia would gain significant flexibility to address our environmental, First Nations, and socioeconomic objectives without needing agreement from the United States. British Columbia would also have certainty for 20 years for compensation as our share of the treaty benefits. The Americans would see a reduction in the Canadian entitlement, the share of downstream power benefits that the US sends to British Columbia in the form of electricity. They would also benefit from affordable, pre-planned flood risk management in keeping with one of the treaty's most important functions to reduce the risk of damaging floods in the United States. And it should be said that this is the reason why the modernization of the treaty has support across the political spectrum in Canada and has support across the political spectrum in both sides of the Senate aisle in the United States, and has done throughout the process. The encouragement has been direct. It's been from Republican senators and from Democratic senators, just as it has been from politicians of different partisan stripes on this side of the border. Since 2014, modernizing the treaty has enjoyed that bipartisan support. It is in the interest of both countries to renew the treaty in the ways that Canada and the United States agreed to in the agreement in principle. This agreement in principle also reflects the interests voiced by First Nations and who are local governments and residents of the BC Basin, who've been involved in the process and in the negotiations directly and regularly from the beginning. When Canada was in Washington last in December to negotiate on turning the AIP into a renewed treaty, representatives of First Nations were there with us, part of our delegation in the room for those discussions. We will act in everyone's best interest, and we will defend Canada. In the case of the Columbia River Treaty, we will do that at the bargaining table. I want to address, finally, some of the comments that have been made by Mr. Trump about BC having a giant faucet or about the United States taking our water. We need to be clear that the water has flowed and continues to flow along the Columbia River downstream into the United States. The BC Treaty dams are used to manage the timing and volume on the Columbia River and provide flows across the Canada-US border consistent with treaty operating plans. Once the water crosses the border, the US can manage it for their own domestic purposes, however they see fit. In other words, the river flows into the United States, and at that point, it becomes their water to manage. So the idea that Canada can supply water through the treaty for broad American needs is not accurate and is not a concern, although it reflects, I think, the nature of the current debate and intentions expressed towards Canada in the American government. I also want to emphasize that the agreement in principle is not legally binding, and until a modernized treaty is ratified, the existing treaty remains in place, including the interim agreements negotiated last year. We've heard from many residents, in particular those around the Arrow Lake Reservoir, who rightfully want to know what to expect in terms of operations this year. With the existing treaty and interim arrangements and current March water supply forecasts, Columbia Reservoir operations this summer are expected to be similar to and possibly less challenging than the previous 2 years. While we would have wished for more snow by now, this year's snowpack conditions are better than they were last year in both the Columbia and the province in general. There's still about a month remaining of potential snowpack accumulation, and without knowing how much rain we'll get in the coming months, however, it's still too early to forecast whether the Columbia Basin will have an average water year or something less than that. At the same time, we do not expect any major flooding this year so far. Variability in weather, however, can always send some surprises, and BC Hydro continuously plans to operate over a wide range of outcomes. As they do every year, BC Hydro is preparing to give their annual spring updates and will have more to say on what kind of water year you can expect in different parts of the basin. There's been a lot of talk about the importance of taking a united approach or a Team Canada approach when navigating our relationship with the United States. In terms of the treaty, it's also critical to work together in British Columbia to ensure Columbia Basin interests are upheld. There's a key, that's been a key element of our work since efforts to modernize the treaty began. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of two groups, the Columbia River Treaty Local Government Committee and the Columbia Basin Regional Advisory Committee that play a key role as we move through the treaty modernization process. They help to keep the process grounded in local perspectives, as both groups are composed of elected representatives and citizen members from across the BC Basin, who provide suggestions and advice about what an improved treaty could look like. I also want to acknowledge the exceptional efforts of the Canadian negotiating team, led by Stephen Gluck of Global Affairs Canada and including Kathy Eichenberger of our own BC Government Columbia River Treaty team, who's here tonight to assist in answering questions. I also want to extend my gratitude to the Tanaha, the Shwetbuk, and the Silk Okanagan Nation representatives, and acknowledging how critical their role has been as full participants on the Canadian negotiating team, and their significant contributions throughout this process in making a better Columbia River Treaty for future generations. I note that in previous webinars we've had the Canadian representatives here. All of you understand that the federal general election has been called in Canada, which limits the participation of federal officials in public events, but they are, of course, attending the call tonight, and we are very proud of their work and our association with that work as well. As we move forward, there is, of course, some uncertainty, and we know that uncertainty is in place for all of you. We know about the frustration, the feeling that after this many years, surely we should have the new treaty in place, the new treaty that will allow more control, and it has advantages on both sides of the border. We are not there yet, but we are no less resolute to get there. I hope that gives you a bit of a picture of where we are at this time, what our approach is to these discussions. I think it's important to recognize that we've consistently kept brief all members of the legislature from the Columbia Basin, from the Kootenays, up and down on both sides of the House, and we're going to continue to do that. And but what I wanted to do now is have you hear from two of your representatives in the region. And I want to start with MLA Brittny Anderson to say a few words, followed by Steve Morissette. Over to you, Brittny.
Thank you so much, Minister Dix. As a lifelong resident, I've certainly never seen in my life so much interest in the Columbia River Treaty as we do in this moment right now. And I'm really grateful for everyone who is joining this session with us this evening. I've been MLA for the last 5 years, and throughout those years, I've been learning about the treaty's past, present, and what is hoped for in the future. I've also really appreciated previously Minister Conroy and currently Minister Dix for keeping myself and other MLAs, including Steve Morissette, who is joining us tonight, involved and updated on this issue. And so last fall, to serve as a bridge to a renewed treaty, the Canadian and US entities were able to negotiate interim agreements under the existing treaty. Minister Dix mentioned these agreements briefly, but I'd like to elaborate on what they are. These agreements enable continued operations and put into effect some aspects of the agreement in principle. They ensure that the Canadian entitlement will continue until 2044, securing predictable benefits to BC over the next 2 decades. The Canadian entitlement is BC's share of the increased power generating potential of the US system and is sent to BC in the form of electricity. Rights to transmission are secured for both BC to both receive the Canadian entitlement and to access other power supplies. And the pre-planned flood risk management operations, as outlined in the agreement in principle, are implemented for a 3-year period, and that BC is compensated accordingly. Reaching the agreement in principle also triggered the next phase of BC's public engagement process, a process that started over a decade ago. Since 2012, people have voiced the need for an improved treaty that better supports ecosystems, First Nations, and communities in the basin, and that reduces impacts on this side of the border. We always said that before a modernized treaty was finalized, we would come back to the basin to explain what was being proposed and to seek feedback. We have shared a great deal of information about the agreement in principle on the website, including content of the agreement in principle. We've held 2 previous virtual information sessions and launched a survey for people to provide their feedback. We are very pleased that we have received a considerable response to our agreement in principle survey from people across the basin, in addition to your letters, emails, and phone calls. This evening's session is the latest part of our engagement process. We look forward to visiting Basin communities for in-person meetings once there is more clarity around next steps on the path towards a modernized treaty. We know many of you have been invested in the treaty for years, some for decades, and some of you listening today were around when the dams were first created. We thank all of you for your dedication to this very important agreement. We also want to note the passing of a longtime resident of the Basin and passionate advocate for Basin residents and the treaty, Mario Scalero. We look forward to hearing your questions this evening. Thank you very much. And I would now like to pass it over to MLA Steve Morissette.
Thank you so much, MLA Anderson and Minister Dix. You know, I'm a lifelong member, lifelong person that's lived in the Basin all my life, and I'm getting up to speed quickly on the intricacies of the CRT. In my past life as a local government official, you know, I was fortunate to be on our local regional district and hear the updates from our representative Linda Worley regularly. So it's not new to me, but a lot of the intricacies are great to learn now. And I'm regularly being briefed, and I'm working closely with Minister Dix and MLA Anderson. I'm talking with people in my constituency and hearing their concerns. I also want to thank, as well as Minister Dix did, the Local Governments Committee and the Columbia Basin Regional Advisory Committee for their hard work. Having these local voices is so important, and their contributions are vital. Minister Dix shared where we are right now. I'd like to take a few minutes to recap how we got to where we are. As many of you know, the process to modernize the Columbia River Treaty began more than a decade ago. On this side of the border, the BC government started engaging with First Nations, local governments, and residents in the Basin in 2012 about what interests matter to them and what changes they wanted to see in the treaty. The feedback from those years of engagement fed into our negotiating positions when Canada and the US began formal talks to modernize the treaty in 2018. After 6 years of negotiations under the previous two US administrations, President Trump and Biden, we reached an agreement in principle in July 2024. This agreement in principle meant that we had found common ground between US and Canadian interests and a clear path forward to modernizing the Columbia River Treaty in a way that would strike a fair balance and benefit both countries. Reaching the agreement in principle triggered the next phase of negotiations as the two countries embarked on drafting an amended treaty text. Through the latter months of 2024 and into this January, Canada and the US worked tirelessly to draft the text of a modernized treaty that reflected what the two countries had agreed to in the agreement in principle. Through that drafting process, the teams made significant progress towards a modernized treaty that provides benefits to people, communities, and the environment on both sides of the border. Despite these efforts, the two countries have not yet reached agreement on a modernized treaty text. We'll continue to work on this as Minister of State Anderson said. We will be out in the communities going forward as we get more information, and we'll keep you informed as we can going forward. Thank you.
MLA Morissette, MLA Anderson, and Minister Dix, really appreciate your opening comments, kind of a status of where we're at right now and how we got to where we are. Obviously a very complex time to say the least. So we have received a lot of questions, seeing a bunch coming in, so let's get to it if we can. I'm going to start with a couple of questions we received ahead of time and pass it over to the minister to answer. So the first one asks, during the pause in moving towards ratifying a modernized treaty, what is the basis for BC Hydro's operations of the reservoirs? Will there be changes in BC Hydro operations during the pause compared to the past? Oh, Minister, you're muted.
You know, I knew that would happen. The basis for BC Hydro's operation is to comply with the requirements of the current treaty, including power coordination, the flood risk management laid out in the interim agreements, as well as operating to meet domestic load in BC. So this pause, the pause in the negotiations, has no bearing on BC Hydro's current operations. BC Hydro will continue to operate similarly to the past.
Great. Thanks very much, Minister. And I'll ask one more, and then we'll go to some of the questions that have been entered into the Zoom here. So this one is from somebody who lives in Valemount, BC. So my family resides in Valemount, and each year, Kinbasket Reservoir water levels fluctuate dramatically. The reservoir actually recedes so much that up to 15 kilometers of dry bottom is exposed on the north end each year. This dry bottom creates terrible dust problems in the valley and especially in the village of Valemount. Many Valemount residents have valid air quality concerns and are worried about respiratory health. What can Valemount residents expect this year and future years in regard to keeping the reservoir full to the mouth of the Canoe River?
So as you know, the Kinbasket Reservoir is the battery that charges the Mica and Revelstoke dams, which produce up to 5 Site Cs for people in BC who know where the Site C dam, the new Site C dam is, worth of electricity. To do that, the reservoir needs to force water through the Mica and Revelstoke turbines when electricity is most needed, such as in winter and now, alas, more often than not, in hot summers as well. When quite a bit less water and limited water is actually coming into the reservoir, then Mica shuts off completely to allow the reservoir to refill. The BC Columbia River Treaty team, in conjunction with the village of Valemount, has over several years conducted air quality studies, including the frequency and impact of dust storms. I'd urge you to contact the village of Valemount to get a copy of the report, which has quite interesting findings. In addition, there continue to be efforts to revegetate some areas of the reservoir to draw the reservoir drawdown zone to reduce dust exposures. I encourage you to take a look at the report if you haven't seen it, although I suspect the person asking the questions has seen it. And but for other people on the call, especially people from Valemount, to take a look at that report.
That's great. Thanks, Minister. And actually, I'm going to ask one more of these advanced questions that were sent to us ahead of time, and then we'll move over to some of the others. So this one is asking what provisions in the Columbia River Treaty related to water storage and release that could be adjusted to optimize river flow specifically for industrial uses, such as log transportation and other manufacturing processes?
Yeah, so the Columbia River Treaty Local Governments Committee has been consulting with Interfor, for example, and I think this is related to them, this question, on what flow and reservoir conditions should be used in the modeling of alternative Columbia River Treaty operating scenarios to meet our Canadian socioeconomic objectives. The information Interfor has provided is captured in performance measures used in evaluating the benefits or impacts in each scenario. Once specified operating alternatives are further advanced, the province will be consulting Basin communities and stakeholders, including Interfor and other players in industrial activity in the region on those options. So that's kind of where we are right now on that question.
Great. Thanks, Minister. So I'm going to call on one of our colleagues as part of the BC Columbia River Treaty team, Jeff Gosson. He's been monitoring the questions coming through Zoom here. And Jeff, I'd like to ask if we have a question we can ask the minister that's come into us during the meeting.
Yes. So what is the plan to see salmon back in Arrow Lake? Can restoration of anadromous fish runs up the entire Columbia River system be added into this treaty, either as an amendment or a renegotiated treaty?
So I'm going to ask Kathy Eichenberger, who's at the table for us on these questions, and perhaps we might also hear from some other people who are at the table to speak to this point. Over to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Minister. Yes, salmon is very core to the modernization of the treaty and very core to First Nations on both sides of the border. and Basin residents. When we started consulting and engaging with communities in the Basin and local governments, everyone wanted to see the return of the salmon. It was something that was so precious that was lost. And there was a growing confidence that it is possible. It could be possible. In fact, there have been salmon that were fished in Trail and Castlegar very recently. But I would like to really ask our First Nations colleagues who are at the table, part of our negotiating delegation, to maybe answer that question. And maybe Jay, if you could start off, that would be wonderful.
My name's Jay Johnson. I have the honor and the privilege to help represent the Syilx Okanagan Nation in these negotiations. I've been advising and participating as a negotiator for the Chiefs Executive Council of the nation for a couple of decades now on a variety of matters, and partly grew up in the Basin and recognize a number of folks here online, and big hello to you and Lim Lim for being here and listening and still having keen interest in these negotiations and in the treaty and its impacts to everyone. And so first of all, just to say a few words about the process, this is really the first time that Indigenous nations have their own voice inside of an international negotiating treaty directly. And I just want to hold our hands up to the federal government and the provincial government for advocating for us to be part of that of this negotiation process, and officially as observers, but obviously as participants in helping shape the positions that we hold at the table. And likewise, in the United States, the Colville Confederated Tribes and their U.S. relatives in the States are represented on the U.S. side, including the Sinaiks communities are represented on the U.S. side, sit across from us and participate in the U.S. discussions and inform those positions as we move forward. And there are obviously some mutual interests that we have around salmon, around ecosystems, around cultural values. And we've worked hard to embed those into the agreement in principle and hopefully get back to the table and be able to put the agreement in principle into a specific treaty language, which will enhance the objectives and the needs and the outcomes for each of those items. So for salmon, we've worked hard to make sure that we still maintain the fish flow augmentation, which is 1 million acre feet of water, which will be used primarily in the spring to ensure that the smolts are carried downstream and have a chance to return. We have added an additional 0.5 million acre feet for dry water years, which we didn't have before, which is essential for the survivability of salmon, and particularly in the context of climate change and the challenges that all of us face in the future in that regard. But also we've deepened the collaboration up until fairly recently with the U.S. Folks in regards to salmon studies and operations and fish passage. There's a considerable amount of investment in the United States for passage over Grand Coulee and Chief Joe, and we're really looking forward to the outcomes there to ensure that the salmon eventually have a passive way to get over those blockages and up into the Canadian portion of the river, which of course is the spawning grounds, natural spawning grounds for the salmon. In terms of the sockeye in the system right now, up to 80–90% of those salmon spawn in Canada and in the Okanagan tributary. And that's thanks to the hard work of the Syilx Okanagan Nation with the relatives of the United States, Colville Confederated Tribes, UCUT, United Columbia Upper Tribes. A ton of work being done and carried out to ensure salmon have the ability to survive and show the way in the future. So we're building on success. We're doing our best to ensure that the water systems accommodate salmon and consider salmon and cultural values and ecosystems. We've also preserved a specified operation of water, which is anywhere between 1 and up to 4 million acre feet in Canada. And that allows us to look at revegetating the ring around the fluctuation that currently exists in the reservoir, particularly in the Arrow. But we're looking at Kinbasket and others, which will dramatically enhance ecosystems. It will provide riparian and protected areas, and it will provide important habitat for salmon and other fish species, aquatics and avian species. So we're looking very creatively at how we maximize the operations in a way that will benefit all ecosystems as we move forward. So lots of work to do, lots of studies to do, lots of deep collaboration that we still have to maintain with our partners in the United States and with our tribal relatives in the United States. And we look forward to continuing those discussions when we get back to the table. So Lim Limt.
Thanks very much, Jay. So I've got another question that was sent to us ahead of time. Minister, now that power coordination and flood risk management are in place through interim agreements and ecosystem, Indigenous and socioeconomic interests for Basin residents and payments for other U.S. benefits to BC are in limbo, those are all part of the AIP, what would motivate the U.S. to return to the negotiating table?
Well, remember, the interim agreements were put in place so that the Canadian entity, which is a term in the treaty that is BC Hydro, really would be able to implement treaty operations prior to a negotiated modernized treaty being in force. The other very important elements of the treaty on both sides of the border that are beneficial to Canada, beneficial to the Columbia Basin, beneficial to the United States will be implemented when a full modernized treaty comes into force. Remember, the United States has only 3 years of flood risk management, so the full modernized treaty will need to be in place by then on that critical question for the United States. What I would say is this, that we have to be resolute now, that these provisions are in place and the Columbia River Treaty continues to be in place. But we have had these significant threats to our sovereignty, and these discussions are taking place in that context. We are committed. We have an agreement in the United States. It has broad support on both sides of the border, but we have seen that broad support on both sides of the border in the present context may be insufficient to influence the US government. So this will require British Columbia, Canada, First Nations, the people of the region, to both keep the faith, because we're going to get there, but also to be resolute in the face of what is really unprecedented action against our country, against our province, against our people. So we're going to stay with it, but there is, I think, a need for both sides to get down to it. And there's as much need on the United States side as the Canadian side, and as much support amongst people on the United States side and amongst senators on the United States side as there is on the Canadian side.
Great. Thanks very much, Minister. So, Jeff, I'll call on you again. Another question from the Q&As here.
Yes. To what degree are First Nations integrated into the design and decision-making of a renewed Columbia River Treaty? They should be at full equal footing with the agencies and governments of Canada and the US for this process. If they are not currently fully equal, why is that, and how can that be changed?
Well, I'm going to maybe turn to Nathan or to Troy to respond on their own behalf. Let me say this: that what Jay Johnson said in his previous response, I think, really holds here. That this is unprecedented. When we have negotiations, for example, at the State Department in Washington, D.C. in December, everybody is there and part of it. Canada is there, and we have an outstanding team for Canada. British Columbia is there, and First Nations are there. The region has been significantly represented as well in this process, elected representatives and regular people in the region through our processes as well. So I think what we're doing here is something unique in the history of Canada, and I'm very proud of it. And it makes all of us stronger and I maybe can turn, if that's okay, Nathan, to you to say a few words in response to the question.
Well, I think the negotiation of the Columbia River Treaty has been certainly positive in many respects to the First Nations in the basin. We've been provided a seat at the table. That was one of our objectives, was to have a voice in how the treaty was negotiated. So we go to all major every negotiation session that there is at the Canada-US main table. We have sub-tables, and we're attending all of those. So we're involved with all of the planning and the strategy and pre-meetings and post-meetings, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that's a really important thing, is to recognize that we have rights within the basin, and that this activity is moving toward the recognition of those rights, or it is a recognition, and also that whole effort toward reconciliation is dealing with our relationships and our rights in a good way. Jay mentioned the specified operations, where we have 4 million acre feet to adjust the levels of the reservoirs and the flows of water between, to really help the environment and to make the operations of the system more appropriate for First Nations people in terms of access to the river and to the reservoir areas to carry out traditional activities, hunting, fishing, gathering, medicines, those kind of things. And again, the joint ecological body, that body in the AIP that was set up to have Canada, First Nations, and US tribes working together, taking leadership of that whole idea of a one river, where we're looking at the overall health of the river system, and including the things I just mentioned. So lots of efforts being made to address what we feel are the rights that we have to sit and help with decisions, and to deal with the infringements, all of the negative aspects of the construction of the dams and the operations to date. So yeah, it's not easy. It's a good challenge. It's one thing to have a seat at the table, and the other thing is to have an effective voice. So yeah, so thanks. Oh, and I am the Secwepemc representative to the negotiations.
Thanks very much, Nathan. Jeff, do we have another question?
Yes. Does BC or Canada have scenarios for different potential behaviors of the US?
The short answer is yes, of course. And we are preparing for all scenarios. There has been some discussion of what might happen, because we're living in this extraordinary time, I should say, in the first Trump administration. Canada, the United States, and Mexico signed a trade agreement, which the United States, even though it was signed by the same president who's in office now, does not seem to take very seriously. At the time, they suggested, as all of you know, that that agreement was a fantastic agreement for all three countries. And now we see the response we're seeing with respect to tariffs and threats to our sovereignty. I think what Canada has to do is what we are doing, which is responding as a country together, as coming together as a country, as taking action together as a country, united in what we need to do, as provinces taking actions within our jurisdictions, but linked to the actions of other provinces. When Premier Legault or Premier Ford or other premiers act, we are very supportive of them, and vice versa. But we need to take all of these actions, and we need to prepare for all of the scenarios that are facing us. I think that's critical to do now with respect to the Columbia River Treaty, but all of the issues facing our country. with respect to, again, the U.S. government and actions that they might take with respect to the importation and exportation of power, we have to be prepared for that. Fortunately, with BC Hydro, we have a Crown corporation wholly owned by the people of British Columbia, which is a tremendous resource for us to raise and to respond to these issues as they come forward. This gives us a fundamental advantage. We are awash in renewable energy and renewable energy opportunities in British Columbia. We are working closely with other provinces such as Alberta to protect our interests, one another's interests, their interest and our interest in these issues. And I think doing all of those things significantly helps us, and staying connected to you. I've never seen such a response from Canadians in my lifetime of unity and support for one another. We saw similar actions during the pandemic, and I was, as you know, part of those, but it is remarkable. I want to say one thing, because there are some Americans on this webinar. We love the United States. We have always loved the United States. This is particularly true in the Kootenays, where there's deep cross-border connections, as there are in my communities. We admire people and Americans, and we do not understand the treatment we are receiving when we've been allies for all these many years. But we are taking, I think it's important in these times to hear the noise, and there is a lot of noise, but see the signal. And the signal is working together to produce clean energy. The signal, the long-term interests of our two countries, continues to join together on so many things and so many issues with families and friends and neighbors and states and provinces and countries. And so we have to be determined, but we believe in Canada, we're going to get through this by staying united and staying together.
Jeff, do we have another question?
Yes. The Canadian entitlement payments listed in the new interim period determination of downstream power benefits appended to the Assured Operating Plan 2025 are substantially less than the yearly Canadian entitlement payments received under the old Columbia River Treaty, even when added to the flat rate flood control payments. What was provided to Canada in return for reducing the Canadian entitlement payments?
I think what I'll do is turn to either Kathy Eichenberger or Les McLaren of our team to go through this in detail, and then I'll follow up with some comments on what might broadly call the politics of it. So over to you, Kathy, first of all, or to Les to take us through the discussions, and then I'll have a few things to say at the end. Kathy?
Thank you, Minister. And I'll just start and pass it along to Les. So the Canadian entitlement and the way it's calculated was developed in the early 1960s, and it was based on a number of assumptions that tried to forecast what the Pacific Northwest energy system would look like in 60 years. Well, of course, they made many assumptions, and one of the authors of the Columbia River Treaty, Gordon McNabb, who passed away recently, but he told many of us when he was alive that they made these assumptions and none of them came true at the end. And so the contribution of the power coordination to the overall Pacific Northwest energy system has changed over time. And so the contribution is less when you look at a greater mix of resources in the Pacific Northwest. It varies on the load and what is being used to meet the load. And therefore, the importance in the early 60s and 70s was greater than it is today. And then so in the US, there are many stakeholders who, power groups who have been saying that it needs to be adjusted to reflect what the fair value would be today. We think we really believe we have reached this fair value. The Canadian entitlement was always predicted to go down in the latter portion of the treaty years, in the latter portion of the 60 years. And so now we have a lesser amount in the first part of the 20 years, but a greater amount in the latter part. And it provides us certainty, something that we can count on and that we don't have to argue over year after year after year. So Les, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Just one thing to add is we looked at this as a package that included not just the entitlement, but annual escalating payments for flood risk management that were not in the current treaty because the original arrangements from the 60s expired last September, along with the other benefits, along with the flexibility that we secured under the IP. So in looking at that as a package compared to our treaty continue scenarios, we determined that this was overall in the best interest of British Columbia and Canada. I'll leave it there, Minister.
Yeah, thank you. And really over the 20 years, we see this based on what we understood. We negotiated this. This was a discussion between ourselves and the United States. Obviously, they had interest to bring to the table, and so did we. And we negotiated this agreement, which I think is a fair agreement, both on the Canadian side and on the US side. And it reflects the tenor of the discussions, which is we had strong views about from people in the Columbia Basin, the First Nations, and our own government on these issues, and the United States government and the United States representatives and neighboring states to us had strong views as well. And we came together over a period of years and resolved those in an agreement in principle that benefits both sides. And there was give and take in that discussion. And I'm proud of our negotiating teams that really represented our interests very well. So I think what we have is a treaty that's in the interest on both sides of the border. And obviously the current situation and instability in the United States affects that. But we, because we have a strong treaty and because we have that's still in place, and because we have a negotiation that is in both of our interests and our collective interests, Canadians and Americans, we think we're going to get there eventually.
There was a question that it sounds like you kind of just answered, but I'll ask it anyways in case you'd like to elaborate. But what does it take? Why does it take so long to implement or negotiate the treaty? Why has it taken so long to get to where we are here?
Well, I think because the issues are significant. First of all, let's, as we've noted at the beginning, this is a treaty that continues to be in place. So there is, of course, a different urgency in these discussions when you have a treaty that continues to be in place. We arrived at an agreement in principle that is the frame for the agreement, and have been busy, and we're busy in the months that followed as a delegation trying to implement that. But in the end, it is challenging to do an international treaty. We've seen this before. More challenging on the American side, where the advise and consent of the U.S. Senate is required, and 2/3 of it at that, if you can think of that in the modern political landscape of the United States, which has in recent times, especially in the months leading into the election and since, been quite divided on their side. On the Canadian side, it's easier. It really requires the support of federal and provincial representatives, and the significant role of First Nations and communities as part of that as well. So the issues are significant. There's a lot at stake. The people of the Columbia Basin, I heard someone in the chat, I saw someone in the chat say this earlier, this is, for people in British Columbia, really important, and people have talked about it. But for the people of the Columbia Basin, this is visceral. This is part of their lives and histories and souls. And so the issues were important. They were certainly important for First Nations, but for everyone who lives in the Columbia Basin as well. And that's why it took a while, because what we wanted to do was engage the whole region and have a negotiation that brought the best possible treaty and the most possible local control to people living in the region. I think we've achieved some of those goals, but it has taken a long while. It would have been preferable, I know, that we'd had a treaty signed and passed through the Government of Canada, the Government of BC, the US Senate, etc. That has not happened. But I think the values involved remain important, and we've got to continue at this point not to be shaken by the noise, but to see the possibility that the renewed treaty will bring, and to continue to work for it and to stand strongly in our positions. And we surely intend to do that.
Thanks very much, Minister. I think looking at the time, we have time for one more question, and then maybe we can move into closing comments. Jeff, do we have one more question to ask?
Yes. With the potential of a federal government change in Canada, what impact will this have on the state of the AIP?
And unmute yourself, Minister.
Well, and I think I might ask to after this for Les or Kathy to speak to this. This is an unusual treaty. It's an unusual treaty in two important respects. One, this negotiation has been unusual because of the involvement of local communities and of First Nations. That makes it unusual. And I think if we can get to a final treaty, unprecedented and very profound for people living in the region. So that's the first set of things. But the second set of things is the Canadian entity in these negotiations. And I won't go back over all of the history of this. The Canadian entity is really BC Hydro and the province of BC. Right? So we are, in many respects, we have unbelievable Canadian negotiators who are supporting it. But in some ways, our province, British Columbia, is driving the bus in a way that we would not normally do in a treaty negotiation, where our role would be that of subnational government. So in that respect, the federal election, and look, I'm on a line with 568 people. I'm not going to say the federal election isn't important. People in my neighborhood know who I'm voting for, and it is absolutely critical that everybody participates and everybody votes. This is one of the most important federal elections in our history. But with respect to these negotiations in the AIP, frankly, I think that we expect the support and the continuing support of the federal government for British Columbia. We are the Canadian entity in these discussions, and I'm hopeful that will happen and believe that will happen, regardless on this question of the result of the election. Reminder, I did not say the election didn't matter. I think it matters profoundly, but I will speak about those things in another forum. Maybe Les, you could say a few words about that, just to finish on
thanks, Minister. Just a reminder, the treaty was signed in 1961, but not ratified until 1964. And during that period, WAC Bennett negotiated an agreement with the federal government called the Canada-British Columbia Agreement, under which most rights and obligations were transferred from Canada to British Columbia, including the Canadian entity, the responsibility to build and operate the facilities. Canada also agreed not to amend or terminate the treaty without BC's consent. And through this process of modernization, back in the 1990s, when the entitlement was returning to British Columbia after the initial 30-year sales from the 60s, the federal government, Canadian federal government, has been totally honoring that and very supportive, understanding that any changes to the treaty either are a benefit or a cost in British Columbia. And so I would expect that to continue. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Les and Minister. So we're about 1 minute to the top of the hour here. So I think we'll move into some closing comments. I just want to thank absolutely everybody for your questions. There's almost over 100 questions submitted here, many having common themes, and I'm hoping we're able to have addressed some of that this evening. And then, of course, like I said, we'll attempt to respond to the other questions through other methods, but really appreciate everyone's time and attention to the questions. I want, before turning it over to Minister Dix to close us out, I want to thank all of our speakers, Minister and MLAs Anderson and Morissette, Kathy and Les, Nathan, Jay and Troy. Thank you all for your time in being here and your work over the years on these negotiations. and of course to all of you listening in. And a reminder that a recording will be available afterwards. We'll email everybody a link. If there's any follow-up questions you have, feel free to email us back. In the meantime, we encourage you to keep visiting our website, and we'll share a link to that at the end of this session. And we'll be in touch, of course, as things move forward and as there's more news to share. So keep an eye out, an ear out for more news. But with that, I'll pass it over to Minister Dix to have some closing comments. Go ahead, Minister.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us. And we're going to continue to do this, both in this forum and I hope in person in the region after the legislative session. It's absolutely our intention, and we'll understand why we haven't proceeded to meetings and information sessions in local communities, given the current pause in the negotiation. But all of that said, the Columbia River Treaty still in place. We have interim arrangements; they are in place. We have an agreement in principle in place, and we continue at the task of turning that into a full and modernized treaty. And that will take continued unity on our side in the face of this disruption that we're seeing in Canadian life by the United States government this time. We have to do this in this and in all areas of our lives. Lots of countries in the world, of course, face these kind of issues every day of their existence. In fact, Canada has been fortunate in some respects to have what we often call the longest undefended border in the world, and a peaceful relationship with our neighbors. Lots of issues, always lots of issues, lots of differences, lots of different views about our relationship in Canada and in the United States, but still a peaceful and, in many respects, on both sides of the border, supportive, even loving relationship at times. This has been disrupted in this time, and we have to be more determined than ever, more resolute than ever. And Canadians who are buying Canadian right now, Canadians who are supporting one another, need to continue to show this. This is going to be a hard period on this and many other issues. But if we stick together, we will get through it together. And I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Premier Eby for all of the political parties in Canada, all the political parties in the United States for their commitment to these issues over time. And I believe together we can turn our agreement in principle, which reflects the needs of the region, into a full and modernized treaty. In the meantime, we have a treaty, and we're going to stick to our positions and our view of how that treaty should be brought into force, a view that shares benefits between Canada and the United States and treats the Columbia Basin in a way that's renewed under a renewed treaty into the future. Thanks very much. Thanks for joining me. All of the questions you're asking online tonight, the last time we got together, we went through and did that and systematically responded to questions. And you can expect our team to do the same thing this time. Thanks for being here, and have a great evening.
Thanks so much, everyone. We'll share some contact information at the end here. Really great to see everyone.